Good evening everyone, thank you for joining me and welcome back to another long-awaited video. This video has already been filmed and as I was editing it, like 5 minutes away from finishing editing it, my other half decided to tell me that it sounded like I was reading from a script. Thank you for that, James. Thank you very much. So of course, naturally, I have decided to re-record the video because it played on my mind. And for the record, this is a long case. I am going to be splitting it over 2 videos, so there'll be 2 parts to this one. And I do have notes. I have notes that I am going to have to read from because today we are talking about none other than Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, probably one of the most notorious serial killers in the whole of America, if not the world. And recently, Dahmer's name has come back into light because of the Netflix series starring Evan Peters and directed by Ryan Murphy. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore Evan Peters and everything that Ryan Murphy has put out has been amazing. What I want to do with this video is separate maybe a little bit of fact from fiction. Although the series was incredibly good and it was really well done, and for the most part they did really well to keep it to the true story, it's not 100% accurate, and I do feel that they kind of romanticised certain parts of it as well, which obviously isn't the case. So here we are today, we're going to be discussing Jeffrey Dahmer. This is as accurate as I hope I could possibly get it. There is so much information about this guy on the internet that you do kind of have to debunk and go from case to case witnesses and different recollections to try and build what essentially is the truth. But let's face it, considering the amount of people that Dahmer murdered and the fact that Dahmer himself is also dead, we're probably never going to know 100% the full story. As I say, I have a lot of notes. I have a lot of notes to go through. So it probably is going to come across that I'm reading from a script, but I'm going to try my best. We are in our new house, so I'm now in a different room for filming. It's probably going to be a little bit echoey. I don't have curtains up in this room yet, and curtains seem to hide a lot of echo. Echo! Yeah, we're echoing. This is one of those cases that I said that I never wanted to do, mainly because I feel it's been done over and over and over again already, and I didn't really know what I could add to the story. But with the popularity of the Netflix series and then the later release of the Jeffrey Dahmer Tapes, I kind of felt like I had to. This is your warning. This case is very, very disturbing. We're going to be talking about lobotomy, necrophilia, sexual assault, rape, dissection, mutilation, murder, animal mutilation. The list just goes on and on with this one. So please, if you are easily offended, proceed with caution because we are really going to get in with the details of this one. On July the 22nd, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Joyce and Lionel Dahmer welcomed their firstborn son into the world. They named him Jeffrey. Joyce was a teleprint instructor and Lionel was a chemistry student. From what can be found online, Jeffrey's early years, he was a happy and energetic child, and there weren't any causes for concern. Until the age of 4, he had to go into hospital to have a double hernia procedure, and at that point, from then on, things just didn't quite seem right with Jeffrey. He wasn't the same happy, fun, energetic child that he used to be. His home life began to take a bit of a slip as well. Joyce, his mum, she suffered from depression and she was a hypochondriac. She was always very tense and on edge, and she used to take this out on Lionel. She craved attention and pity from him, which Lionel didn't give. She was incredibly argumentative, and Lionel was quite absent because of his studies. He spent a lot of time away. Joyce began spending the majority of her time in bed, and at one point she actually tried to commit suicide. She overdosed on Equinol, and when Lionel later spoke to her about it, he just thought it was a cry for attention, because ultimately that was the sort of thing that she liked to do. She craved the attention from him, and she was constantly argumentative and creating this conflict in the house. When Jeffrey started school, he was described as a timid child. He had a few friends, but nothing much. His teachers noticed early signs of abandonment, but back then things like that never got reported. Why? I don't know. I guess it's very different nowadays, but hey ho. Joyce became pregnant with her second child while Jeffrey was in elementary school, and the family then decided to move. It was around October and they moved to Dalestown, Ohio. Joyce actually gave birth in December, and both her and Lionel agreed to allow Jeffrey to name the baby, and he named him David. The abandonment and the neglect became more apparent. Lionel and Joyce spent very little time with Jeffrey. He was a bit of a loner and an outcast. He spent a lot of time by himself, and the arguments at home between Lionel and Joyce just escalated, really. They never dwindled, they just got worse. From a young age, Jeffrey showed an interest in dead animals and animal bones. He once witnessed his father removing animal bones from under the crawl space of their house. Lionel later said that Jeffrey was oddly thrilled by the sound that the bones made, and that he compared them to fiddlesticks. When Jeffrey turned 8, the family moved again. This was the third time they'd moved in 2 years. They remained in Ohio, but they went to Bath. Lionel and Joyce had purchased a property that was situated on 1.5 acres of woodland, and hidden out of sight at the rear of the property there was a wooden hut of sorts. And it was around this time, at age 8, that Jeffrey began to collect insects like moths and butterflies, and he would keep them in the hut in the garden. His interest in the insects escalated to the point where he began taking roadkill home that he found on the road. From that point he began to dissect the bodies of the dead animals and preserve different parts of them in different stages of decomposition in jars of formaldehyde that he would keep in the hut. And allegedly Lionel had no idea that this was going on, and by this point Joyce just didn't care, I guess. But I find it a little bit hard to believe that you're not aware of the things that your 8-year-old child's doing. There was an incident where they were having family dinner one night, and Jeffrey was paying an interest to the chicken carcass. He asked Lionel what would happen to the bones if he was to pour bleach on them. Lionel took this as scientific, and he was quite excited by it. He thought that Jeffrey was showing an interest in the scientific method of these things, and that excited him because he was a chemist, and he thought that Jeffrey might end up going down the same route that he did. So he actually showed him how to preserve the bones correctly, and Jeffrey then began applying these techniques to the roadkill that he found. He then obviously began keeping the bones, particularly the skulls. For some reason he'd make makeshift crosses, and he'd place the skulls on the top of the cross. During his teenage years he attended Revere High School. There was an incident in his biology class where they'd been dissecting pigs, and Jeffrey stole one of the dead piglets, showed it to a friend, and when his friend was like, "What are you doing? That's a dead pig," he said he was curious to see how it fit together. There was another occasion where he found a deceased dog in the woodland. He took the dog back to his hut where he decapitated it. He then nailed the dog's body to a tree and impaled the dog's head on a stick before inviting a friend back over, and he told the friend that this was how he found it. By the time Jeffrey was a teenager, he began relying on alcohol. The continued loneliness and the constant fighting between his parents made him turn to alcoholism. He also went to school with the alcohol, and I'm not talking like a beer here and then, I'm talking really hard liquors with a really high alcohol content. He would hide them in his coat pockets, and it wasn't unknown either. He wasn't hiding it well. People were well aware that he was bringing alcohol into school. He was confronted at one point by one of his classmates, and he told him that it was his medicine. And he was always described by his teachers as being really intelligent, but that he only ever received average grades. It was around the age of 14 that he realised that he was gay. He kept this from everybody though. In, the 1960s and 70s, although it's 2022 now and people are still being shamed for being gay, lesbian or part of the LGBTQ family. So nobody knew that he was gay. He didn't tell his parents, he didn't tell the few friends that he had. He kept it a secret. And it was around this time that he actually began starting to have those dark fantasies. He wanted a fully submissive sexual partner, somebody that he had full control over, that wouldn't answer back to him. His fantasies evolved and they began to include the animal carcasses that he'd been dissecting, and he would masturbate over them. And he later admitted that this did, at the start, disturb him. He never explained where it stemmed from or what could have caused it, so we'll never know that. He began to fantasise about a male jogger that jogged past his house daily. He fantasised about hitting him over the head and rendering him unconscious and then being able to sexually assault him. He attempted to act out on this fantasy once. He sat behind a bush with a baseball bat in the hopes that when the jogger went past, he would be able to hit him and live out those fantasies. But that day, the jogger didn't go past his house. In his final years of school, he completely changed his persona. He became a bit of a class clown. He imitated having fits and random mumblings, hitting himself, to the point where his classmates began referring to these things as doing a Dahmer. By 1977, his parents finally decided to separate. Allegedly, Joyce had an affair with another man. Lionel was the one who decided to move out of the house, and he moved into a motel not too far away. And shortly after Jeffrey graduated in 1978, Joyce decided to also move out. She packed her things, she packed David's things, and just got in her car and drove away. Because by this point Jeffrey had turned 18, he was allowed to be on his own. She could leave him there. So he'd spent a couple of weeks by himself. He spoke to his dad a couple of times, hadn't heard of his mother at all. He was still heavily drinking alcohol. And on the 18th of June, he was driving back from the convenience store when he spotted a shirtless hitchhiker at the side of the road. Dahmer said that him being shirtless awoke his sexual desires, which encouraged him to pull over. He offered the guy to go back to his house where they could drink beer, smoke a bit of weed, have some laughs, listen to music, that kind of thing. The hitchhiker's name was Stephen Hicks. He was just 19 years old, and his plan was to hitchhike to a rock concert that he wanted to go to. Unfortunately for Stephen, he came across Dahmer. I don't know what encouraged him to go back to Jeffrey's house, whether he felt safe because he was of a similar age, I really don't know. So when the two went back to Jeffrey's house, that's exactly what they did. They drank, they listened to music, they smoked weed. Jeffrey knew that Stephen wasn't gay because he'd been talking about girls, so he knew that nothing sexual was going to come of it. However, It got to the point where Stephen wanted to go, he wanted to carry on, and he wanted to go to this rock concert. This is what triggered something in Jeffrey. He didn't want Stephen to go. He'd, for years, been abandoned by his family. I think he must have thought that he was being abandoned by Stephen. Of course, that doesn't condone what he did. When Stephen was about to leave, Jeffrey decided to pick up a £10 barbell off the living room floor, and he decided to hit him across the head with it. This knocked Stephen out instantly. Jeffrey then proceeded to use the barbell to strangle Stephen until he was no longer breathing. Jeffrey then stripped Stephen's body, where he began to explore it. He also masturbated over Stephen's dead corpse. He then later in the night attempted to dispose of the body. He placed his body in bags and placed them in the back of his car, began driving down the road with it. It was late, it was like 3 a.m. He'd been drinking, so he was swerving when a police car drove past him. Naturally, the police car doubled back, came back around, pulled him over. When the police officer approached the car with his torch on, he asked Jeffrey what was in the bags. Jeffrey said that his parents are in the process of going through a divorce and that the bags were filled with rubbish that he was just throwing away. He remained so calm and collected that the police officer believed this and let him go. Jeffrey didn't dispose of Stephen's body like he originally planned. I'm not sure whether this scared him, but he returned back to the house where he put the bags with Stephen's dissected body into a waste pipe outside, and he left them there. Later, Jeffrey recovered Stephen's body. He continued to dissect and dismember the corpse. He pared the flesh from the bones and dissolved the skin in acid before smashing the bones with a sledgehammer and then burying them in the back garden. He quite literally scattered Stephen's bones throughout the wooded area to the point where very, very little to nothing was ever recovered of Stephen, and he wasn't actually convicted of Stephen's murder until quite a while after he was convicted of the other murders. It took that long to get a conviction for the murder. After several weeks, Lionel actually returned back to the family home with his new girlfriend, Sherry, and at this point he discovered that Joyce had left Jeffrey by himself and that Jeffrey had been drinking quite substantially. Lionel encouraged Jeffrey to enrol at university, and he paid for 2 semesters outright for him. But upon attending uni, Jeffrey continued his alcohol abuse, and after just 1 semester he dropped out. So he went back to the family home with Lionel and his now fiancée Sherry. Jeffrey was very lazy. He had no intention of going and getting a job, and in January 1979, after Lionel's constant nagging, he enlisted in the military. Jeffrey was trained as a medical specialist, and shortly after his training was complete, he was then deployed to West Germany. He was only ever described as a slightly above average soldier. He did continue to drink throughout his military career, and although he worked somewhat hard during his time in the military, it was later revealed that he did actually sexually abuse 2 men while serving. One of the men was just 17 years old, and Dahmer subjected him to months of abuse, not just physical abuse but also sexual abuse. He did go on to report this to superiors, but no further action was ever taken. After serving as a medic for 2 years, he was honourably discharged, but the reason really for him leaving the military was that he was constantly drinking and it affected his performance. He decided that he couldn't return back to his dad's house. He was already perceived as a bit of a failure back at home. So he requested to be dropped off at Miami Beach in Florida instead, where he got a job pretty much straight away in a delicatessen, and he began living out of a hotel. He basically rented a room in a hotel. It didn't last long at all. Jeffrey completely squandered his wages on alcohol. His hotel bill was going unpaid until eventually he was evicted from the hotel. He then spent a couple of weeks sleeping rough on the beach itself before he finally resorted to calling his dad. His original intention was that he would just be able to get his dad to send him some money. Lionel flatly refused to do that. He knew what Jeffrey would do with that money, so he bought a plane ticket, and Jeffrey then returned back to Ohio to live with Lionel and Sherry again. It's now September 1981. Jeffrey's back living in Ohio with his father and his stepmom. He still didn't get a job. He was told by his father that he would have to do different chores around the house, but he continued to drink excessively. After just 2 weeks of being back with his dad, Jeffrey went out binge drinking one night, and he got arrested for drunken disorderly conduct and was given a 10-day suspended sentence. At this point, Lionel had had enough, and he decided it was time to kick Jeffrey out. He was then forced to go and live with his grandmother. So Dahmer returned back to Wisconsin to live with his grandmother. She was the only person that he'd ever really had a loving relationship with, and he truly doted on her. I think the plan was that she might be able to get him set on the right track. For a while living with his grandmother, things were actually going well. He completely cut down on the drinking, not 100%, but he cut down significantly on his alcohol intake. He would help his grandmother around the house, he would take her shopping, he would go to church with her. He got a job as well. He took a job as a phlebotomist, and things seemed to be going quite well for him during this time period. He had one disturbing incident while he was working as a phlebotomist. He stole a vial of blood and he went up to the roof of the building to drink the blood. However, he allegedly instantly spat it out and did not like it at all. He did eventually get laid off, and he remained unemployed for 2 years. At this point, he began drinking again. In August of 1982, Jeffrey exposed himself to at least 25 people at the Wisconsin State Fair. He was arrested and then ordered to pay $50, including paying the court fees. Well, he didn't pay them, let's face it. His grandmother paid it because he didn't have any money because he didn't have a job. And again, after this instance, things started going back on the up for Jeffrey again. He got a job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Wisconsin, but we wouldn't be doing this video if things didn't take a very dark turn. There was an incident when he was at a library one evening. He was approached by a man who threw a note to him. The note was propositioning the offer of oral sex, and although Jeffrey didn't reply to this letter, it started his dark and twisted fantasies again. Because Jeffrey didn't feel like he could openly be gay, he began to visit the bathhouses in Milwaukee. Here he could be himself and experiment sexually with other men, but he was not happy with his sexual partners. He didn't like them moving around or talking. He viewed them as objects of his pleasure and not actually as people. So it got to a point where he began to drug the drinks of the men he intended to have sex with. He would drug their drinks with sleeping pills, and when they would become unconscious, he would then sexually abuse them and rape them. And he managed to get this pretty constant supply of sleeping pills because of the job that he had at the chocolate factory. He worked nights there. It was 5 nights a week. It later went up to 6 nights a week. He would visit his doctor and basically say that it affected his sleeping pattern and he struggled to then get to sleep when he weren't at work. So his doctor prescribed him sleeping pills, which he could get every couple of weeks. He obviously would get complaints. The men that he would sexually abuse would wake up in a room by themselves, completely oblivious to what had gone on, and then they would complain to the owners of the bathhouses. Eventually he got banned. He didn't just get banned from one bathhouse, but all of the bathhouses in Wisconsin, because it was a tight-knit community and everybody looked out for one another. So he had his memberships revoked from all of them. This didn't deter him though. He then began to pick up men in bars where he would go back to hotel rooms and drug them there instead. So it didn't slow him down or stop him at all. At one point, Jeffrey stole a male mannequin from a department store and he kept it in his closet when he weren't using it. You know what I mean. He kept it in his closet and eventually his grandmother found it one day. She obviously freaked out and demanded that he get rid of it. There was later an attempt of him to unearth a coffin of a deceased 18-year-old that he'd read about in the paper. His plan was to take the corpse back to his grandmother's house to experiment on it. Thankfully, he did not manage to dig the coffin up. He reported that the ground was too hard to do so. I'm not going to question it. On the 8th of September 1986, Jeffrey was arrested for a 3rd time for masturbating in front of 2 young boys. When he was arrested, he told police officers that he wasn't masturbating and that he was just urinating and the boys just happened to be there and they saw him. But eventually he admitted to what he'd done and was sentenced to 1 year's probation. And he was also ordered to seek counselling, which he did, and he was deemed sane, that there weren't anything wrong with him. Even though he was on probation, you would think that it would stop him doing the things that he was doing. However, he continued to take men to hotel rooms and drug them and rape them. He continued to do that while he was on probation, completely not fazed by the things that he was doing. Eventually, his hotel shenanigans took a really dark turn. On the 20th of November 1987, Jeffrey met 25-year-old Stephen Toomey in a bar and he convinced him to go back to a hotel with him. When Jeffrey awoke the following morning, his hands were bloody. He noticed Stephen's body next to him. His body had been beaten black and blue and his chest appeared to be caved in. He also had blood dripping from the side of his mouth. Jeffrey had, or he says he had, no intention of killing Stephen and he has no recollection of killing Stephen. He says it was never his intention to do so and he actually had to rent out the hotel room for another night to dispose of Stephen's body. What Jeffrey did was go out and purchase a suitcase. He returned to the hotel where he stuffed Stephen's body into the suitcase and called a taxi to take him back to his grandmother's house. The taxi driver actually commented on the weight of the suitcase and joked with Jeffrey, saying, "What have you got in here, a dead body?" And Jeffrey played it off all calm and cool, like everything was absolutely fine, when in actual fact that is exactly what he had in the suitcase. Once Jeffrey had returned to his grandmother's house with Stephen's body, he put the suitcase in his grandmother's basement and he left Stephen there for a week. He then began to dismember Stephen's body. He severed the head, his legs, arms and torso, And then he filleted the flesh from the bones, cut the flesh into smaller pieces and disposed of them in garbage bags. He then cleaned the bones, wrapped them in a blanket and then smashed them with a sledgehammer. He then threw away Stephen's remains in a large bin outside his grandmother's house. He kept Stephen's head for 2 weeks before he boiled it and then placed it in bleach and detergent in the hopes to retain the skull. He wanted to use Stephen's skull as a stimulus for masturbation. However, the preserving process that he used made the skull brittle. So he then took the sledgehammer to Stephen's skull and disposed of it the same way that he had done with his body. 2 months after Jeffrey had murdered Stephen, he met 14-year-old James Doxeter. Although James was only 14 years old, he was already selling his body for sex in exchange for money. So Jeffrey offered him $50 to go back to his grandmother's house with him for sex. Back at his grandmother's house, Jeffrey then drugged James's drink with sleeping pills. Once he was unconscious, he strangled him. He then put James's body in his grandmother's basement and he kept him there for a week. After a week, he disposed of James's body in the exact same way that he had disposed of Stephen's, again attempting to retain the skull. Using the same process that he had previously, the skull was again too brittle and he disposed of it later on. On the 24th of March 1988, Dahmer was at a popular bar called the Phoenix where he met Richard Guerrero. He offered him $50 in exchange to spend the night with him, so the two returned to Jeffrey's grandmother's house, where there Jeffrey offered him a drink and laced it with sleeping pills. He then proceeded to strangle Richard using a leather belt. When he was dead, he performed oral sex on his body. He then disposed of Richard's body the same way that he did with both Stephen and James, retained the skull, but kept this skull for several months before disposing of it later on down the line. On the 23rd of April 1988, after drinking with friends, Ronald Flowers returned to his car to find that it would not start. Ronald lived in Illinois and was now stranded in Wisconsin when he was approached by what he thought was a man that was going to help him. The man suggested that Ronald followed him back to his house where he would get his car and his jump leads, and then the two would drive back to Ronald's car and jump start the car so that Ronald could get home. Ronald clearly felt that he could trust this man. He seemed like a trusting guy. So he returned to the man's grandmother's house with him. He was offered a coffee. Ronald, knowing that he had a long drive home, accepted the coffee, not known to him that it had been laced with sleeping pills. Soon Ronald had passed out. However, Dahmer's grandmother had woken up. She could hear voices downstairs and she knew that Jeffrey was not alone. So she called down to Jeffrey to ask who was there. Jeffrey said no one. Knowing that his grandmother was awake and had heard somebody else, Jeffrey was spooked. So instead of killing Ronald, he actually drove him to the hospital. He didn't take him into the hospital, he just shoved him out of his car and then drove off. When Ronald woke the following day, he was dazed and confused. He was lying in a hospital bed and didn't know how he'd got there. He noticed that he'd got random bruises and marks on his body. He tried to discharge himself from the hospital, and at this point he noticed that his underwear was actually inside out. And on further inspection he found a blonde hair inside his underwear. Ronald, trying to piece the evening together, then remembered that he'd met Jeffrey. He was then adamant that Jeffrey had sexually assaulted him, so naturally went to the police station to report it. The police did not do much with this information. They went and spoke to Jeffrey. However, Jeffrey told the police officers that they had both had consensual sex, that they'd both been out drinking, and that Ronald had just drank too much, so he took him to hospital. It was the 70s. Police had a problem with gay people, and so they didn't follow up on this any further. About a year later, Ronald actually recalls seeing Jeffrey getting into a car with another man on a night out. He ran over to Jeffrey and confronted him, but Dahmer denied knowing even who he was. So Ronald turned around to the guy that was getting in the car with Jeffrey and said, "Don't go home with that guy, he's crazy." This then caused the gent that was with Jeffrey to leave alone. Jeffrey got in the car and drove off. We have no idea who that man was, but I think it's pretty safe to say that Ronald probably saved his life that night. If he hadn't have bumped into them, 100% Jeffrey would have murdered that guy as well. Back at Jeffrey's grandmother's house, she had had enough of his late night antics. She'd had enough of his drinking. She'd had enough of the strange men that he was bringing home that she didn't know who they were. She had no problem with him being gay, but it was the fact that he was doing this so late at night with absolutely no respect for her. She also began to notice the smell that emanated from the basement. So she turned to Jeffrey and said, "You need to leave." So in September of 1988, Jeffrey moved into a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 25th Street in Wisconsin. The area was a predominantly black neighbourhood, and Jeffrey was one of the only white people in the area. Although he stood out, he kept himself to himself. He was quiet. The other residents, they saw him coming and going from work. He was a nice neighbour as far as they were aware. On the inside though, things were very, very different, and just 2 days after Jeffrey moved into the apartment, he went home with a young boy. Dahmer lured 13-year-old Somsak Sinthasum Foam back to his apartment in exchange for nude photos for money. But of course we know that that's not the case with Jeffrey, and he offered Somsak a drink which had sleeping pills in it. At this point, Somsak endured hours of sexual assault from Jeffrey. He did not pass out, however, and eventually Jeffrey fell asleep. So Somsak managed to leave the apartment and ran back home to his family. Back home, his family understandably then reported this to the police. This then resulted in Jeffrey's 4th arrest. This actually went to court, and Lionel hired a lawyer to defend Jeffrey's case. He underwent a series of psychological tests and eventually he pled guilty. His charge was 2nd-degree sexual assault and for enticing a child with immoral purposes. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison, however he was released after just a week, but he was put on a sex offenders register. During his time on probation, Jeffrey temporarily moved back in with his grandmother. Here, he spent 10 months on work release. 2 months before Jeffrey was actually sentenced for the sexual assault of Somsak, Jeffrey went on to kill his 5th victim. 24-year-old Anthony Sears was working as a baker in Wisconsin. Although he had a girlfriend at the time, he was bisexual, and he met Jeffrey Dahmer on the 25th of March 1989 at a gay bar. Dahmer took Anthony back to his grandmother's house where he drugged him with sleeping pills, waited for him to fall unconscious, and then strangled him. Jeffrey then decapitated Anthony before placing his body in the bathtub and trying to skin him. He then dismembered the body in previous ways that he had done. He then disposed of Anthony's dissected body in the trash. However, Dahmer found Anthony exceptionally attractive, and he decided to retain some of his body parts. He kept Anthony's head and genitals, and he stored them in acetone in an attempt to preserve them. He didn't feel safe enough to keep these parts at his grandmother's house, so he actually took them to work with him and kept them in his locker. When he moved back to his apartment, he then took Anthony's remains back with him. In May 1990, Jeffrey met 32-year-old Raymond Smith and lured him back to his apartment. Money for nude photos. It always seems to be that way with him. You know what he did? He drugged and strangled him. However, with Raymond, he actually took photos of his body in various suggestive poses and different stages of dismemberment. He then boiled the body parts in a steel kettle which he'd added silex to. This stripped the flesh from the bones. He then rinsed the slimy bodily fluid substance down the sink and dissolved the bones in acid. He retained the skull and he spray painted it black. He actually kept that. That was one of the skulls that they found when he got arrested. He displayed this skull alongside Anthony Sears's. He displayed it on a cabinet that he intended to turn into a shrine for his victims. He actually kept Raymond's heart and biceps for later consumption. He went on to recall that the heart was tender, like filet mignon. This guy is so sick. On June the 14th, 1990, Jeffrey met 27-year-old Edward Warren Smith at the gay bar The Phoenix in Milwaukee. The two actually hit it off, so it didn't take any convincing for Edward to return back to Jeffrey's apartment with him. However, here we know what he did. He drugged and strangled Edward, then he stripped the flesh from his bones. He actually retained Edward's skeleton. He put it in his freezer in an attempt to remove any moisture from the skeleton. His previous methods of drying out the bones had obviously turned them brittle, so he wanted to try and stop that from happening. He placed the rest of his body into a vat of acid where he dissolved them. After months in the freezer, Jeffrey realised that the moisture was not going to come out of the skeleton, so he tried a different method of drying out. He placed Edward's skull in his oven. However, this did not work at all and the skull actually exploded. Because this didn't work, he then disposed of Edward's skeleton in the vat of acid, and because of this, there was never any part of Edward's body ever recovered. Jeffrey later went on to say that he felt terrible about this murder because he didn't manage to retain any of the body parts. Not because you'd killed somebody, because you didn't manage to retain his body parts. On the 2nd of September 1990, Jeffrey met 22-year-old dance student Ernest Miller outside a bookstore. Dahmer found himself incredibly attracted to Ernest's body. He was a dance student, he was incredibly fit. So he convinced him to go back to his apartment in exchange of money for nude photos. Back at Jeffrey's apartment, the two engaged in consensual sex before Jeffrey then attempted to give Ernest sleeping pills, but he only had 2 remaining, so Ernest did not fall fully unconscious. Jeffrey, feeling like he had no choice, decided to then slit Ernest's throat. This, of course, killed him within minutes. Dahmer later went on to say that he then engaged in sexual intercourse with Ernest's body, including penetrating his severed throat. He then dismembered Ernest's body in the bathtub. However, he retained his heart, calves and thighs for later consumption. He kept his entire skeleton and stored it in a filing cabinet. On the 24th of September 1990, just 2 weeks after Jeffrey murdered Ernest, he met 22-year-old David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall. He murdered David in the usual way and disposed of his body in the usual way. However, he didn't retain any part of David's body. When questioned later down the line, Dahmer said that he wasn't his type, and although he says that, he actually took photos of the dismemberment process of David's body, so I don't really know how true it was that he wasn't his type. David Thomas was unfortunately another one of Jeffrey's victims who no body part was ever found for. His family actually had to identify him on the Polaroid pictures that Jeffrey had taken instead. I can't even begin to imagine how awful that must have been for his family. To not have any part of him to bury, but to also have to identify him on those truly disturbing photos. It was just awful. On the 18th of February 1991, 17-year-old Curtis Strota, an aspiring model, was waiting at a bus stop outside Marquette University where he was approached by Jeffrey Dahmer. He lured him back to his apartment, and here he once again drugged and strangled him. Jeffrey dismembered him in the bathtub and again photographed the process along the way. He disposed of Curtis's body in the vat of acid, however he retained his hands and genitals. On the 7th of April 1990, 19-year-old Errol Lindsay was out running errands for his family when he bumped into Jeffrey. He went back to Jeffrey's apartment with him, where he was, of course, drugged. However, this time things got even worse. If you can imagine that they can get worse, that is. While Errol was unconscious, Jeffrey took a drill to his frontal lobe. He drilled approximately 3 inches into his brain, and he then injected acid into his brain. Lobotomy is used in an attempt to alter somebody's personality. Jeffrey was obviously attempting to create a completely submissive partner that he could keep and have complete control over. And this was his attempt when using this truly horrific technique that he continued to use more than once. Incredibly, this did not kill Errol. In fact, he woke up, but Dahmer then decided to strangle him anyway. He then disposed of Errol's body, however he retained the skull. This was one of the skulls that was later found by investigators in Jeffrey's apartment with the drill hole visible. Dahmer also later went on to refer to this as his drilling technique. This guy was just completely messed up. On the 24th of May, 31-year-old aspiring model Anthony Hughes was at popular gay bar Club 219 with friends. Anthony was a deaf and mute man. However, he still had high hopes and aspirations, and he would talk to his friends by using a notepad. It is said that Anthony spotted Jeffrey and that he approached him. Anthony's friends go on to recall that they were certain that Anthony already knew who Jeffrey was and that the two were friends and had been friends for some time. Because of this, Anthony went back to Jeffrey's apartment with no concerns, no worries. Back at Jeffrey's apartment, he wasted no time in drugging Anthony and then using his drilling technique. He injected acid into Anthony's brain before strangling him until he was dead. He then took numerous Polaroid photos of him, again in various positions, but not at dismemberment. He actually kept Anthony's body in his apartment for 3 days. In those 3 days, Jeffrey performed various necrophilic acts on his corpse. He finally dismembered and disposed of Anthony's body. However, he once again retained his skull, and he also kept the notes that the two had exchanged, which he was going to use for his shrine. The Polaroid photos are actually available to view. I have seen them. I've seen them a few times. They are horrific. But if you're mentally deranged like I am and you want to see them, you can. They are available on the internet. I do not recommend it. I do not recommend it, but they are there. Tony's friends are convinced that the two knew each other prior to the murder. Friends are convinced that they not only had a friendship but also a sexual relationship together. Anthony's mother also recalls him mentioning a friend called Jeff at one point. However, she only had a first name to go off, so she couldn't report this to the police. They had no more information. After Jeffrey's arrest, he denied knowing Anthony prior to the murder. Though everyone else, friends and family, they don't agree with that statement from him. They are all convinced that the two had known each other for some time and that Anthony trusted Jeffrey and would have gone back to his apartment with no concern for his life. I'm going to end this one here because it's a lot. It's a lot. It really is. And it's heavy and it's disturbing. And I think we all need to maybe have a little bit of meditating after this. Maybe a nice hot bath, a little relaxation. Yeah. This is part 1 of the Jeffrey Dahmer episode. I hope you have made it this far. I know it's disturbing, so this is probably going to come across as really weird, but I hope you enjoyed it to some extent. Anyway, the second part is going to be coming along shortly. I will try and get that filmed within a week of this one going out and posted within a week of this one going out, so hopefully you won't have too long to wait between the two. Anywho, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed me rambling on about really disturbing and gross things, because for some reason I find them really interesting, and I hope you do too. If you do, please do consider giving me a subscribe and maybe a like on this video. The more people that like it, the more chance it stands of other people seeing it. So, thank you. Anyway, I will catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching. See you later. Bye.